If Rabuse Gilliman is the easiest Primarch to understand, then Lionel Johnson is probably one of the hardest. Not because he's badly written, it's actually quite the opposite. The Lion is difficult to understand because he spends most of his life deliberately making sure nobody understands him. Even his brothers struggled, and these were men who had known him for centuries. There is a reason that whenever discussions about the Primarchs arise, people often describe Gilliman as a ruler, Russ as a warrior, Dawn as the defender, Sanguinius as the angel, and Horus as the leader or the heretic. The Lion is usually described with a different word: dangerous. Not evil or cruel, but dangerous. There has always been something slightly unsettling about him, something difficult to define. And I think that's because the Lion embodies one of the oldest archetypes in mythology. The knight who enters the dark forest and comes back changed. The hunter who spends so long chasing monsters that he starts to resemble one himself. The solitary king, the wandering hero, the man who belongs more comfortably among beasts than people. When people talk about Lionel Johnson, they often focus on his military achievements. The First Legion, the Rangdan genocides, his reputation as perhaps the most formidable battlefield commander among the Primarchs, his legendary duels, his brilliance strategically, all of this matters of course. But if you really want to understand the Lion, you need to begin much earlier. You need to begin in the forests of Caliban, because Caliban explains almost everything about him. Caliban was no normal world, even by Warhammer standards, and Warhammer standards are admittedly quite generous when it comes to unusual planets. This was a world covered by immense forests filled with horrible monsters, not ordinary predators, warp-tainted horror, creatures lurking in ancient woods that seemed determined to kill anyone unfortunate enough to encounter them. It was a world defined by fear, a world where civilization existed only in small pockets surrounded by the darkness. And somewhere in those forests, a child landed, a Primarch, completely alone, no family or guidance, no protection. For years, the Lion survived by himself. This detail often gets overlooked, really. We know it happened, we acknowledge that it did, but we rarely stop and think about how extraordinary this actually must have been. Imagine being a child raised not by society, but by a hostile wilderness. Imagine your earliest lessons being total survival, your earliest companions being silence and nothing else. Your earliest experiences being violence. That kind of upbringing shapes a person. The Lion grew up learning that weakness was danger, trust was danger, hesitation dangerous as well. The forest did not forgive mistakes. The monsters certainly didn't, and so he became exactly what he needed to become, a predator himself. There is a quote from the Heresy novels that I have always loved. One of the characters describes the Lion in a way that feels almost perfect, and it goes, "He was a wild thing pretending to be civilized." Now, that's not entirely fair, because the Lion is genuinely intelligent, cultured, and educated. But there is truth hidden within that description. Beneath the armor and the titles, there remained something primal about him, something untamed. Many Primarchs felt larger than life. The Lion often felt older than life, as though part of him belonged to an earlier age, an age before cities, laws, civilization itself. Eventually, he was discovered by Luther and the Order, and this is where one of the most important relationships in his entire life began. Because Luther was more than a mentor, he was more than a father figure, more than a friend even. For a time, Luther was arguably the single most important person in the Lion's world. And that relationship is absolutely central to understanding his character. The Lion trusted very few people in his life. Very few. Luther was one of them, perhaps the first, perhaps the most significant, which makes their eventual betrayal all the more devastating. But we'll come back to this later. Because first we need to talk about what happened when the Emperor arrived. The Emperor looked upon the Lion and immediately recognized what he had created. a weapon. Now, admittedly, every Primarch was a weapon, but the lion always felt to me slightly different. Russ himself once described the lion in a fascinating way. He essentially compares himself to the Emperor's executioner, the weapon everyone sees, the threat everybody understands. Then he describes the lion as something else entirely, the weapon kept hidden, the weapon reserved for the darkest tasks. I've always thought that this distinction is very important for the lion's character, because it explains the role the lion played during the Great Crusade. The Dark Angels were often entrusted with responsibilities that other legions never received: forbidden weapons and ancient technology, and even secret missions. The First Legion occupied a unique place within the Imperium, and at the centre of all of this stood the Lion, a Primarch whose greatest strength was arguably not his skill at war, it was his willingness to do whatever was necessary. That is, of course, both admirable and dangerous. The Lion has never been particularly interested in being liked. Many Primarchs cared deeply about loyalty, about friendship, about recognition. But the Lion cared about results. It sounds harsh, and sometimes it was. One of his greatest flaws is often that he struggled to understand people. Not because he lacked intelligence, because emotional relationships never truly came naturally to him. He understood battlefields better than conversations. He understood enemies better than allies. There are moments throughout the heresy where the Lion appears genuinely baffled by behaviour that other Primarchs would immediately recognise. Politics, jealousy, resentment, personal insecurity, these things often surprised him, which is slightly ironic given how much trouble they eventually caused him. The relationship with Luther is perhaps the clearest example. For years, resentment quietly grows. Luther feels overshadowed, marginalised, left behind. The Lion largely fails to recognise the depth of the problem until it's far too late. Not because he doesn't care, because he just doesn't see it. And that blindness ultimately destroys Caliban. I've often wondered whether Caliban represents the Lion's greatest failure, really. Not militarily, but personally. Because unlike many Primarch tragedies, this wasn't caused by chaos, corruption, or manipulation, or warp sorcery. It was caused by misunderstanding, by an emotional distance, by two people who once loved each other slowly becoming strangers. There is something, as is often the case with the Primarchs, profoundly human in this. When Luther finally turns against him and Caliban tears itself apart, the Lion loses more than a homeworld. He loses certainty, and I think this is important. For much of his life, the Lion believed that competence was enough, that if you did your duty properly, everything else would follow neatly behind it. Caliban proved otherwise. Sometimes people need more than competence, they need understanding. The younger Lion never fully grasped this, but the older Lion seems to now, which brings us, of course, to the modern setting. And honestly, I think this is where the character truly becomes fascinating in the lore. Because the Lion who returns to the 41st millennium is not the same man who disappeared. He is older, not physically, although he does have grey hair now, but his spirit seems wiser. For perhaps the first time in his life, he appears almost reflective. There are moments in The Lion, Son of the Forest where he displays a humility that would have been almost unthinkable during the Great Crusade. He actually listens, he questions himself, he acknowledges mistakes. And that could be one of the biggest single character developments any Primarch has experienced, really. The younger Lion was often convinced he was right, almost to a fault, really. The older Lion still believes he's right, he just accepts the possibility that he may occasionally be wrong. It sounds like a small difference, but it is enormous, really, particularly for a Primarch. One thing I find fascinating about the modern Lion is how much guilt he carries. Not openly and dramatically. He's not wandering around delivering tragic monologues every 5 minutes. This is still the Lion that we're talking about here. But there is a sadness to him now, a recognition of everything that has been lost. The Imperium, Caliban, his brothers, his father. Entire ages of history have vanished while he slept. And unlike Gilliman, who often reacts with frustration, the lion seems to react with an acceptance. Not approval, but an acceptance, as though he understands the grief changes nothing, only action will. This attitude may ultimately be what makes him so valuable in the current setting, of course, because the modern Imperium doesn't need another politician. Gilliman has already filled this role. It doesn't need another administrator. It certainly doesn't need more bureaucracy. The Emperor knows there's enough of that already. What it needs is the lion, a hunter, a problem solver, a warrior who specializes in confronting threats others cannot. That's why I think so many fans have fallen in love with the character again recently. Not because he's necessarily perfect, because he's finally confronting his own imperfection. For years, the lion was often perceived as distant, cold, arrogant even. Now we can see the man underneath, the lonely child raised in that haunted forest, the warrior who never learned how to trust properly, the commander who sacrificed relationships for duty, the son who spent his entire life trying to serve an impossible father. And suddenly the character feels far more human. Ironically, after 10,000 years, the lion may be more human than he's ever been. Which brings us to the fundamental question. Who is Lionel Johnson? Is he the greatest strategist among the Primarchs, perhaps? Is he one of the deadliest warriors? Almost certainly. Is he the Emperor's ultimate weapon? There is an argument for this as well. But when I think about the lion, none of those descriptions feel quite complete, really. The best description I've ever found is much simpler. The lion is a man searching for redemption. Not redemption from chaos, not redemption from betrayal. Redemption from himself, his hubris, from the mistakes that he's made, from the relationships he failed to protect, from the burdens he's carried for too long. And this is what makes him so compelling now. Because beneath the armor, beneath the legend, beneath the reputation, the mythology, the lion is ultimately a character trying to become better than he once was. In a setting where so many figures are trapped by their past, that makes him surprisingly unique. The lion spent his youth hunting monsters in dark forests. The irony is that his greatest battle was never against the monsters around him. It was against the flaws within him. And for the first time in 10,000 years, it feels as though he might finally be winning. Among all the Primarchs, Jagadai Khan may be the most underrated. He's certainly not the strongest, fastest, most influential, but he is underrated. There is a difference here, because when people talk about the Primarchs, the conversation usually gravitates towards the same names. Gilliman, the Lion, Sanguinius, Horus, Russ, Magnus, the larger personalities, if you will, the characters who dominate entire eras of the setting. Meanwhile, the Khan often sits quietly in the background for many parts of it, respected and admired but somehow overlooked. Which is deeply ironic, I feel, because if you actually examine his life, Jagadai Khan may be one of the wisest Primarchs ever created. Not necessarily the most intelligent. Wisdom and intelligence are not the same thing for me. Many Primarchs obviously possessed extraordinary intellect, power, but few of them possessed wisdom, and the Khan was one of them. And I think the reason people sometimes underestimate him is because he never sought attention. He never needed it. The Khan understood something many of his brothers never fully grasped. Power and importance are not the same thing. Recognition and value are not the same thing. Being loud and being right are certainly not the same thing either. Throughout his entire life, he remained remarkably comfortable with this reality. To understand the Khan, you have to begin, like with all of the Primarchs on their homeworld, his being Chogoris. Because much like Caliban explains the lion and Chemos explains Fulgrim, Chogoris explains almost everything about Jagadai. Chogoris was a world of open skies, vast plains, endless horizons. A world where freedom was not simply appreciated, it was a way of life, essential. Life was movement, life was exploration. Life was the ability to ride towards the horizon and see what lay beyond it. And into that world came the infant Primarch, the future Great Khan. From an early age, he distinguishes himself not merely through strength or intelligence, but through his curiosity. That's something that people often overlook. The Khan was a curious man. He wanted to understand the world, not necessarily dominate it, but to understand. There is a subtle but important distinction here. Many Primarchs viewed knowledge as a tool. The Khan viewed knowledge almost as a journey, and that attitude would shape his entire life. Eventually he united the tribes of Cho'Garis, but even that achievement reveals something important about his character. The Khan was not particularly interested in ruling for the sake of ruling. He sought unity because it created stability, because it allowed people to flourish, because endless conflict served no purpose at all. This is a reoccurring theme in his story. Unlike some of his brothers, the Khan rarely appears motivated by ego. That doesn't mean he lacks pride. Every Primarch possessed this, obviously. It came with the territory. The difference is that the Khan's identity was never dependent upon recognition. He didn't need applause or validation. He didn't need people constantly reminding him how brilliant he was. In a family filled with Primarchs, that already makes him unusual. When the Emperor did arrive, the Khan accepted his place within the Imperium. But unlike many of his brothers, he never completely surrendered his independence. And I've always found this very fascinating. The Khan was genuinely loyal to the Emperor. Yet there was always a slight distance between himself and the Imperial project. Not opposition, but a distance. Almost as though he was observing events from a step outside of the influence of the circle. Many Primarchs embraced the Great Crusade with almost religious enthusiasm, but the Khan approached it more thoughtfully, as he did with many things, more cautiously. He wanted to know where humanity was going, why it was going there, what the costs may be. Those are dangerous questions in any empire, particularly one moving as quickly as the Imperium. This independent streak is one of the most defining aspects of his personality. The Khan refuses to become trapped by other people's assumption. He refuses to think in a predetermined way. He doesn't follow a path simply because somebody tells him it's the correct one. And honestly, this quality may have saved him during the Horus Heresy. Because when the galaxy began tearing itself apart, many Primarchs immediately chose sides based on loyalty, ideology, or emotion. But the Khan was thoughtful. He paused, and he questioned, he examined the evidence. This sounds ridiculously obvious, but it really wasn't. Throughout the heresy, one of the most remarkable things about the Khan is his refusal to be manipulated. Chaos struggles with him, not because he's immune to temptation, nobody is, but because he understands himself. And this self-awareness, which few of the Primarchs have, is incredibly powerful. The Khan knows who he is. He knows what matters to him. He knows what doesn't. And because of that, he is difficult to deceive. There is a wonderful exchange during the heresy, where various forces attempt to convince him to join Horus. The arguments seem straightforward enough. The Emperor is secretive, the Imperium has flaws, the future uncertain. All valid observations, really. The Khan essentially responds by pointing out that Horus is offering something even worse. And I've always loved this, because it perfectly captures his character. The Khan is not loyal because he believes the Imperium is flawless. He's loyal because he understands the alternative very well, and he judges them honestly. Many Primarchs saw the galaxy through ideology, but the Khan saw reality, what it really was. This is a very important distinction, and this also ties into the matter of freedom, which he is so obsessed with. If there is one concept that sits at the center of Jagadai Khan's character, it is freedom. Not a selfish freedom, not the freedom to do whatever you want. Something deeper. The freedom to choose your own path, the freedom to think independently, the freedom to remain true to yourself. The Khan values this above almost anything, which is why Chaos never truly understood him. Chaos often offers some kind of liberation, a removal of restriction, a breaker of chains, if you will. But the Khan recognizes the deception immediately, because chaos doesn't create freedom, it creates dependency. It replaces one master with another. The Khan sees that for exactly what it is and rejects it again and again. I've often wondered whether Jagged Eye may possess one of the strongest wills among all the Primarchs. Not necessarily the loudest, the most dramatic, but I think he's probably one of the most independent, strongest-minded Primarchs that there is, really. There is a quiet confidence to him that many of his brothers really lacked. He doesn't need to prove himself constantly, he doesn't need to dominate every conversation, and he doesn't need to win every argument. He simply knows who he is, and it gives him an extraordinary resilience, especially in trying times. And then we have to talk about his relationship with war itself. This is another area where people frequently misunderstand him. The White Scars are famous, of course, for their speed, their mobility, their lightning warfare. And because of that, some people assume the Khan viewed war as a game, as something exciting, something glorious. The reality is far more interesting. The Khan understood war better than most, which is precisely why he disliked it so much. He didn't hate it, but he did have a distasteful view on it. There is a maturity to his perspective that feels surprisingly modern. He recognizes war as a necessity rather than a virtue, a tool rather than an identity. Many warriors become defined by conflict, but the Khan never does. Even at the height of the Great Crusade, he remains something more than a soldier. He is a thinking man, a philosopher and a poet. These qualities often get overshadowed by his battlefield achievements, which is unfortunate. As is often the case in Warhammer, the battles and the wars often come first in many people's minds. But these qualities are arguably what makes him so unique. There is an old stereotype that the White Scars are simply fast warriors on bikes, a stereotype that has thankfully faded mostly over the years. Because when you actually examine their culture, you discover something a lot richer. A legion deeply concerned with art, history, storytelling, and self-reflection. And all of that originates from the Khan himself, as is the case with all of the legions. One thing I find particularly admirable about his character is his relationship with authority. The Khan respects authority when it earns his respect. It's not automatic, and he's not blindly following anyone either. It sounds simple, but within the Imperium, it's almost a revolution, really. Many figures either obey completely or rebel completely, but the Khan does neither. He remains independent without becoming disloyal. It is a difficult balance. He doesn't create problems, but he doesn't blindly follow anyone either. He's one of the few characters that manages this successfully, really. And then we arrive at the Siege of Terror, perhaps the defining period of his life, really. The Khan's actions during the siege are extraordinary, really. Not because he performs any impossible feats, though he certainly performs a few of them, because he embodies hope. The Imperium is collapsing, the walls are closing in, the galaxy appears dark and lost, and yet the Khan keeps fighting, not because victory is guaranteed, because it is necessary. And there is something deeply admirable about this for me. Throughout the heresy, many characters are motivated by destiny, really. Prophecy, grand visions, but the Khan simply chooses to do what is right again and again, even when the outcome appears hopeless, especially when the outcome appears hopeless. After the heresy, the story becomes more mysterious for him. Eventually, as we know, he disappears into the webway pursuing the Dark Eldar, and that disappearance feels strangely appropriate for him, really. If any Primarch was destined to vanish beyond the horizon, it was always going to be the Khan. Even now, 10,000 years later, there is something fitting about the idea of him still riding through the unknown realm, still searching, exploring, refusing to remain confined. Which brings us to the fundamental question. Who is Jagged Eye Khan? Is he a warrior? I would say so. One of the finest ever created. Is he a conqueror? I would also say that. His achievements do speak for themselves. He's obviously a Primarch, a loyalist. Yet none of these descriptions really capture him at all, do they? Because at his core, the Khan is something surprisingly rare within Warhammer. He's a free man. Not physically, nobody in the Imperium is entirely free. not politically or spiritually, but he is internally free. The Khan remains free because he refuses to surrender ownership of his own mind, his own values, his own choices. He listens to others, learns from them, works alongside them, but he never allows anyone else to define him. And perhaps that's why he remains such an enduring and interesting character, maybe overlooked even. In a setting built upon fanaticism, dogma, endless war, Jagged Eye Khan stands apart. Not because he rejects duty, because he chooses it. Not because he lacks conviction, because he understands it. Not because he avoids responsibilities, he accepts them willingly. The Khan spent his youth staring towards the distant horizon, always wondering what lay beyond, always searching for something greater. And perhaps that's the best way to understand him. Among all the Primarchs, Jagged Eye Khan may have been the one most interested in the journey itself. Not the destination, the glory, the rewards, but the process, the freedom to choose it as well, and the wisdom to know why it mattered. In a family filled with kings, generals, and demigods, that may be what made him truly an exceptional man. If there is a Primarch who suffers from the exact opposite problem of Jagged Eye Khan, it is Leman Russ. The Khan is often underestimated because people assume he's simpler than he really is. Russ is often underestimated because people assume he's exactly what he pretends to be. And this distinction is absolutely crucial, because one of the greatest misunderstandings in all of Warhammer 40,000 is the idea that Leman Russ is simply a barbarian or a savage, a drunken warrior king who solves every problem by hitting it with an axe. Now, admittedly, Russ spent several centuries actively encouraging people to believe that, so in fairness he bears some responsibility for the confusion, but the reality is far more interesting. Leman Russ may be one of the most self-aware Primarchs who ever lived, and perhaps one of the loneliest. Because beneath the drinking, beneath the boasting, beneath the laughter and the wolf imagery, the endless threat of violence, there is a remarkably intelligent and surprisingly thoughtful man. A man who understands exactly what role he has been assigned, and he secretly hates it. To understand Russ, you have to begin with Fenris, because Fenris is not merely a world, it is a trial, a planet that seems actively offended by the idea of human survival. Volcanic eruptions, frozen oceans, gigantic predators, continents that shift and break apart. Even by the standards of death worlds, Fenris is completely absurd, really. It's the sort of place where a normal person could survive for perhaps 15 minutes before becoming part of somebody else's food chain. And into this world came Leman Russ. The first thing most people know about Russ is the story of the she-wolf, the infant Primarch raised by wolves. It's one of those pieces of lore that sounds ridiculous until you remember you're discussing a setting where demons regularly invade reality and giant space cathedrals travel between stars. By Warhammer standards, it's actually fairly restrained. But the important thing isn't the wolves themselves, it's what the story represents. Russ grows up outside of civilization, outside of society, outside conventional structures, at least in his earliest lessons. They're not political, not philosophical, not academic in any way. They are lessons in survival, hunting in packs, the struggle to endure. Much like the lion on Caliban, Russ is shaped by a brutal environment. Yet the two emerge as very different men, really. The lion becomes isolated, but Russ becomes social. The lion learns to trust his secrecy, but Russ learns loyalty to his pack. The lion becomes a predator who trusts very few people, but Russ becomes a leader who values the bonds between his warriors above almost anything, really. This distinction matters, of course, because while both Primarchs are often described as wild, they represent very different forms of wildness. The lion is a beast lurking alone in the forest. Russ is the alpha of his pack. And eventually, he unites Fenris, as all the Primarchs do. And already we see one of the first major misconceptions surrounding his character, because people tend to imagine him as some sort of unstoppable berserker who simply smashed his enemies into submission. But the reality is, as it often is, far more nuanced. Rus was certainly a formidable warrior, possibly one of the finest, if not perhaps the finest among the Primarchs, but he was also politically intelligent. He was charismatic, adaptable, he understood people, and it's an important detail because it never quite leaves him. Even later in life, when he deliberately cultivates the image of a savage king, his understanding of human nature remains remarkably sharp. And then the Emperor arrives, and this is where things become very interesting for his character. Because unlike many Primarchs, Rus seems to develop a uniquely personal relationship with the Emperor. Not necessarily close, not the warmest, but perhaps one of the most revealing. Rus accepts the Emperor's authority more completely than many of his brothers, yet he also understands something about the Emperor that others struggle with. The Emperor is dangerous. Not merely powerful, but he's dangerous. Rus recognizes it instinctively, and I've always found this fascinating, that Rus simultaneously reveres and fears his father in equal measures. There's an honesty, a humanness to the relationship, if you will. Many Primarchs spend years trying to earn the Emperor's approval. Rus appears more interested in understanding him, and what he discovers is uncomfortable. Because the Emperor is not simply a ruler, he is a nuclear weapon, which means somebody must occasionally act as the weapon's weapon. And that's where Rus enters the story. For much of Imperial history, Rus occupies a unique position. He becomes the Emperor's executioner. Now that's a title fans often throw around casually, but think about what it actually means. Executioners are not celebrated, not admired. Their purpose is unpleasant and dark, necessary but very unpleasant. When something must be destroyed, the executioner is sent. When somebody crosses a line, the executioner appears. When there is no diplomatic solution left, the executioner does the work. Rus understands this, and more importantly, he accepts it. Not because he enjoys it, but because somebody has to. And this acceptance of this role is one of the most defining aspects of his character, really. Rus carries burdens willingly, sometimes foolishly, sometimes unnecessarily, but he does it willingly. It's also where many of his problems begin, of course, because the role gradually consumes him. Over time, Rus becomes trapped within his own legend. The savage king, barbarian, wolf lord, executioner. People begin treating him as a living weapon, with suspicion, and eventually he starts performing the role almost constantly. There are moments throughout the Heresy novels where you can see flashes of frustration beneath his surface. Rus understands that many of his brothers underestimate him. He understands they view him as crude, uncultured, simple. The irony is that he often encourages these assumptions because it's easier, it's safer, and actually more useful for his role. If people think you're predictable, they stop looking deeper. And Rus weaponizes this misconception, and for years it works brilliantly, until it doesn't, which brings us inevitably to Magnus. The relationship between Rus and Magnus is one of the most tragic in the setting for me, because despite appearances, these two are remarkably similar, really. Both intelligent, curious, deeply loyal in their own ways, both convinced they understand danger that others fail to recognize, and both catastrophically stubborn, of course. The tragedy of Rus and Magnus is that neither man fully understands the other. Magnus sees Rus as an ignorant barbarian. Rus sees Magnus as an arrogant fool. Neither assessment is accurate, really. And because neither man moves beyond those assumptions, disaster follows. The burning of Prospero remains one of the most controversial events in Warhammer lore, really. Fans have argued about this for years, and honestly I suspect they'll continue arguing about it for some time. What interests me isn't who was right, it's what the events reveal about Rus himself. Because afterwards we see regret. Not weakness or pity, but regret. Rus begins to question other things, himself, the role that he's been given, assigned, forced upon him, questioning the assumptions that guided his actions. And it's a fascinating development, really, because self-reflection is not something people traditionally associate with Leman Russ. yet it's present throughout his later character arc. The older Russ becomes increasingly philosophical, thoughtful, increasingly aware of his own flaws. There is a remarkable maturity that emerges during the heresy, almost as though he finally grows tired of wearing the mask. And that's really what the barbarian persona is. It's just a mask. Perhaps the greatest mask of any Primarch that was ever worn, because underneath it lies a man who spent much of his life wrestling with difficult questions. Questions of duty, freedom, violence, and a responsibility. Identity of who he really is, wrestling beneath the surface. The very things that people assume he never thinks about, really. I've often thought that Russ and the Khan would have understood one another far better than anyone realised. Both valued freedom, both distrusted rigid dogma, both understood that strength meant more than physical power. The difference was presentation. The Khan hid his strength beneath calm, Russ hid his wisdom beneath chaos. And then we arrive at the heresy, the final stages to be exact. And here Russ becomes one of the most compelling figures in the setting, because he begins changing. Not dramatically or overnight, but there is an undeniable change in him. The reckless confidence softens, the certainty begins to fade away, wisdom starts to take its place. The warrior king slowly transforms into something closer to a philosopher king. There is a sense that Russ finally understands the true cost of war. Not intellectually, but the personal cost. And once somebody understands that cost, they can never quite return to who they once were before. After the heresy, his eventual disappearance feels strangely appropriate. Russ leaves the Imperium behind and journeys into the unknown, seeking answers, purpose, seeking something. The details remain mysterious, and honestly I hope they stay that way for a while longer, because there is something wonderfully fitting about the Wolf King wandering through myths and legends, the great hunter becoming the questing hero, the executioner seeking some form of redemption. It feels almost Arthurian, almost mythological. Exactly the sort of ending that Russ deserves. But obviously, his return will come at some point soon. It brings us to the fundamental question. Who is Leman Russ? Is he a warrior? Absolutely. Few Primarchs can match him, if anyone. Is he savage? Perhaps, when circumstances demand it. He was the Emperor's executioner for much of his life. Yet none of those descriptions really capture him, do they? Because at his core, Russ is a man trapped between two identities, the beast and the king, the warrior and the philosopher, the executioner and the protector, the man and the mask. This tension defines everything about his character, really, and perhaps that's why he remains such an enduring and popular character. Many Primarchs know exactly who they are. Russ spends much of his life still trying to figure it out. The galaxy sees the wolf, his enemies see the barbarian king, his brothers see the weapon. But buried beneath all those labels is something far more interesting, a deeply intelligent man carrying responsibilities he never asked for, a leader who desperately made himself appear less sophisticated than he truly was, to his advantage really. A warrior who understood the price of violence better than most, and a son who spent his entire life trying to fulfill a role that may have been impossible from the beginning. The great irony of Leman Russ is that the louder he barked, the less people listened, and because of that, generations of readers overlooked what was sitting right in front of them. The Wolf King was never simply a wolf, he was the man pretending to be one, and that pretense may have been the most impressive feat of all. Of all the Primarchs, Rogel Dawn may be the easiest to underestimate. Not because he's weak, not because he's unimportant, not because he lacks any kind of depth. Quite the opposite, in fact. Rogel Dawn is underestimated because at first glance, he appears a straightforward character. In a setting filled with secretive masterminds, tortured sorcerers, angelic heroes and demon princes, with enough emotional baggage to collapse a small moon, straightforward can sometimes look boring or perhaps be overlooked. Dawn builds walls, follows orders, does his duty. Dawn says exactly what he means, case closed. Except, it really isn't. Because the deeper you look into Rogel Dawn, the more you realise that what appears simple is actually incredibly complicated. Dawn is one of those characters who becomes more interesting the longer you spend thinking about him. The first time you encounter him, he's a fortress. The second time, he's a fortress with cracks, and the third time you realise those cracks run all the way to the foundation. And suddenly, you're looking at one of the most tragic Primarchs ever created, really. Because Rogel Dawn's story is ultimately about duty. Not the glorious version of duty, not the inspiring version, the ugly version. The version that demands a sacrifice. The version that takes everything from you and then asks for more. The version that leaves you understanding. The version that leaves you standing alone when everyone else has gone. To understand Dawn, you have to begin with Inwit, of course, because much like Fenris explains Russ and Chogoris explained the Khan, Inwit explains Rogel Dawn. Inwit was a cold world, a hard world, a place where survival required discipline, structure, control. People often focus on Fenris when discussing harsh Primarch homeworlds, but Inwit was every bit as unforgiving in its own way. It rewarded preparation, endurance, patience even, and those qualities became deeply embedded within Dawn's character. Unlike many of his brothers, Dawn never seems particularly interested in glory. That is one of the first things that stands out about him. Most Primarchs possess ambition of some kind. Fulgrim seeks perfection. Horus seeks greatness. Magnus seeks knowledge. Russ seeks a purpose. The Lion seeks victory at any cost. Dawn seeks responsibility. Now, this may sound dull, and that would be wrong. Responsibility is a heavy burden, and unlike many of his brothers, Dawn never tries to put that weight down. He simply carries it, again and again, for decades, centuries, millennia. When the Emperor discovers Dawn, he finds exactly what he needs: reliability. Now, reliability is no glamorous quality by any means. Nobody writes songs about reliability, nobody erects statues for reliability. Yet empires are built upon it. The Emperor understood this very well, which is why Dawn rapidly became one of the most trusted figures in the Imperium. Not necessarily the most beloved, not the most charismatic, not the most brilliant, but he was a dependable man. If Dawn promised something, it would happen. If Dawn accepted a responsibility, it would be fulfilled. If Dawn defended a position, that position remained defended. Simple and predictable, almost to a fault, really. I've always found it fascinating that many people view Dawn as rigid. There is, of course, a truth in this, but I think the reality is slightly different, really. Dawn is not rigid because he lacks imagination. Dawn is rigid because he understands consequences. This is an important distinction for me. Many Primarchs focus on possibility. Dawn focuses on outcomes. Many Primarchs ask what could happen, but Dawn asks what will happen if everything goes wrong. And because Warhammer is Warhammer, everything usually does. This mindset naturally leads him towards fortification, defense, preparation. The famous image of Dawn standing atop immense walls isn't just symbolism, it's a reflection of how he sees the universe. The galaxy is dangerous, terrible things are coming. The best way to survive is to be ready. Simple and practical, relentlessly logical. The problem is that this approach works so well that it gradually becomes his entire identity. And this creates a difficulty. Because while walls are excellent at keeping enemies out, they're not particularly good at letting people in. Emotionally, Dawn often resembles one of his own fortresses, controlled and ordered, disciplined, impossible to read really. Many of his brothers struggle to connect with him because he rarely expresses anything that he's feeling. Not because he lacks emotion, because he keeps them in check, suppresses them. This is a big difference, of course. I've always thought one of the greatest misconceptions about Dawn is the idea that he is emotionally cold. He is not. In fact, I would argue the opposite. Dawn feels things incredibly deeply. The problem is that he believes duty requires him to hide those feelings, which means they build up year after year, century after century, pressure accumulating behind perfectly maintained walls. And eventually those walls begin to crack. One of the most revealing relationships in his life is his rivalry with Perturabo, of course. Now, whenever people discuss Dawn and Perturabo, they usually focus on the engineering, siege versus fortification, a professional competition, all of which matters, of course. But I think the relationship is deeper than that, because in many ways Perturabo represents everything Dawn refuses to become, really. Perturabo wants recognition. Dawn wants responsibility. Perturabo resents his duty, but Dawn embraces it. Perturabo allows bitterness to consume him in the end. Dawn buries his bitterness beneath his obligations. The irony is that they are remarkably similar men, really. Perhaps that's why they clash so fiercely. Sometimes the people who frustrate us the most are the ones who remind us of ourselves. Dawn simply handles his frustrations differently. Where Perturabo lashes outward, Dawn turns inwardly. Neither approach is particularly healthy. One just looks more stable. Then we have to discuss the Emperor. And honestly, no Primarch may have loved the Emperor more completely than Rogal Dorn. Not in the emotional sense, not in the way Horus once did. Something deeper, something closer to a belief. Dawn trusted the Emperor absolutely, not because he was naive, because he made a conscious choice. He chose faith, and this decision shaped his entire existence, and it makes the Horus heresy all the more devastating, because when Horus turns traitor, Dawn doesn't simply lose a brother, his entire understanding of reality is shattered. The impossible has happened, the foundation has cracked, the walls are closing in. Throughout the heresy, Dawn carries an almost unimaginable burden. The defense of Terra itself, the protection of the Emperor, the survival of humanity. Everyone remembers Sanguinius during the Siege of Terra. Everyone remembers the Emperor Horus, quite rightly. But I've often thought Dawn's contribution doesn't receive enough appreciation, really. Because whilst others performed acts of heroism, Dawn endured. He did the hard yards for everyone else. Day after day, week after week, month after month, he became the wall. The literal and metaphorical wall standing between humanity and extinction. And that kind of responsibility changes a person. One of the most heartbreaking aspects of Dawn's story is what happens after the heresy. Because despite everything he sacrifices, despite everything he achieves, despite literally helping save the Imperium, he never receives his peace. How could he? The man has spent years watching brothers betray one another, watching worlds burn, watching dreams die, watching the Emperor fall. There is no happy ending waiting for him, only more duty, more responsibility and sacrifice. And he accepts it, again, because that's what Rogal Dorn does. The famous conflict over the Codex Astartes reveals this perfectly. Guilliman proposes dividing the legions, and Dawn hates the idea, absolutely hates it. Not because he enjoys power, because he just sees it as another loss, another piece of the old Imperium disappearing forever. For perhaps the first time, we see genuine anger emerge. Not irritation or frustration, but an actual anger. And honestly, it's one of the most human moments in the entire story, really. Because beneath all that discipline there is a grief, an ocean of it. Dawn simply refuses to acknowledge it. The older I've become, the more I've appreciated that aspect of the character. When you're younger, Primarchs like Russ or the Lion often seem more exciting. They're larger than life, dramatic, mythological beings, really. Dawn becomes more interesting later for me, because you begin recognizing the cost of responsibility, the loneliness of it, the exhaustion of it. Dawn carries burdens that would break most people, and somehow keeps going, even when he probably shouldn't, even when part of him wants to stop. Eventually he disappears, of course. His ultimate fate remains uncertain as of now. Perhaps dead, perhaps alive, perhaps somewhere in between. Honestly, there's something fitting about this ambiguity for him, because Rogal Dorn has always been defined less by where he is and more about what he represents, really. Which brings us to the fundamental question, of course. Who is Rogal Dorn? Is he the builder? Certainly. Some of the greatest fortifications in human history bear his influence. Is he a warrior? Without question. Few Primarchs have demonstrated such relentless determination in battle. Is he loyal? Perhaps more than any other. Yet none of these descriptions truly capture him, really. Because at his core, Dorn is something surprisingly rare. A man who places duty above himself. Completely, utterly, almost to a fault. It sounds admirable, and it is, but it's also tragic, because every sacrifice extracts a price, every burden leaves a mark, every responsibility carries a cost. Dorn spends his life paying that, rarely complaining, rarely faltering, rarely asking for anything in return, or even in the way of help. The galaxy sees a fortress, his brothers see a wall, his enemies see an obstacle. But beneath all of that lies a man carrying grief, disappointment, and exhaustion that would crush almost anyone else. And perhaps that's why Rogal Dorn remains such a compelling character. Not because he never breaks, because he spends his entire life refusing to. Even when every reason in the galaxy tells him he should. The great irony of Rogal Dorn is that people remember the walls he built, the fortresses, defences, monuments. What they sometimes forget is that the strongest wall he ever constructed was around himself, and unlike the Imperial Palace, nobody was ever quite able to breach it. Not Horus, Perturabo, not any of his brothers. Only duty ever found a way inside. In the end, duty may have taken more from Rogal Dorn than any enemy ever could. There are certain characters in Warhammer 40,000 who transcend their own story. Characters who stop being people and become symbols. The Emperor is one, Horus another, and perhaps more than any Primarch, Sanguinius belongs in this category. Because Sanguinius is not merely a character, he is a myth, a legend, an ideal. Even 10,000 years after his death, his shadow hangs over the setting in a way few figures can match, really. Entire worlds pray for him, entire chapters define themselves through him. His image appears in banners, statues, cathedrals, battlefields across the Imperium. And what's remarkable is that unlike many legends, Sanguinius actually deserved it. That might sound obvious, after all he is the angel, the great angel, the golden warrior with wings of white, the beloved son, the hero of terror, the martyr who stood before Horus when nobody else could. But if you reduce Sanguinius to those achievements alone, you miss what makes him so special. Because the reason people loved Sanguinius was never his strength, it was never his beauty, it was never even his heroism. People loved Sanguinius because he understood suffering. Despite that suffering, he chose to hope anyway, again and again throughout his entire life. As with all the Primarchs, to understand Sanguinius, you have to begin on his homeworld of Baal. And Baal is perhaps one of the most ironic Primarch homeworlds in the entire setting. Because if you only knew Sanguinius from the artwork, you might imagine he arrived on some paradise world. Golden skies, shining cities, choirs singing dramatically in the distance. Something suitably angelic. Instead, Baal was a radioactive wasteland, a ruined world poisoned by ancient war, a place where survival itself was a struggle, a place where mutation was commonplace, where death was ordinary, where humanity endured rather than thrived. And into that nightmare descended an infant with great white wings. Even by Primarch standards, that must have been quite the entrance. I've always found it fascinating that Sanguinius begins his life surrounded by fear. Not admiration, but genuine fear of him. Because he is the other, he looks different. Those wings immediately mark him as something unusual, something potentially dangerous, something unnatural. And that experience never really leaves him. This is one of the most important things to understand about Sanguinius. For all his beauty, for all his perfection, he spends much of his life fearing what he might become. It's a surprisingly human anxiety. The angel is terrified of becoming a monster, and perhaps that fear is what prevents him from becoming one. As he grows, Sanguinius unites the tribes of Baal, of course. Yet, unlike many Primarchs, he does so with remarkable compassion. Again and again, we see evidence of his empathy, his kindness, his patience, qualities that can sometimes feel rare within a family of genetically engineered warlords. What makes Sanguinius extraordinary is not that he is powerful, although he certainly is. It's that he never allows power to define him. The easiest thing in the world would have been for Sanguinius to see himself as superior. The galaxy practically begged him to do so. Instead, he spends his life trying to remain connected to ordinary humanity, trying to understand people, trying to protect them, trying to serve something greater than himself. And this humility becomes one of his defining characteristics, and perhaps one of the reasons so many of his brothers admired him. Because let's be honest, the Primarchs were not always an easy group to impress. Many were proud, many were arrogant, many possessed egos large enough to require their own star systems. Yet time and again when we see the Primarchs discussing Sanguinius, there is a genuine affection, a real respect, not merely for his ability but for the man himself. I've often thought there is a reason so many people considered Sanguinius the ideal war master before Horus was chosen. Not because he was the best strategist, the strongest fighter, but because people trusted him. Trust is difficult to earn, particularly among Primarchs. Sanguinius earned it almost effortlessly, and that says a great deal about his character. And then there is the matter of his foresight. Like Conrad Kurz, Sanguinius possessed prophetic vision. And this is where the comparison between the two becomes fascinating for me. Because both brothers carried essentially the same burden. Both saw terrible futures, both glimpsed death, both understood tragedy. Yet they responded completely differently. Kurz looked into the darkness and concluded that darkness would win. Sanguinius looked into the black void and decided it must be fought anyway. That distinction is the heart of his character. I've always believed that Sanguinius is not the Primarch of Hope because he expected everything would work out. He's the Primarch of Hope because he continued believing despite evidence to the contrary. It's much harder, much more admirable, and much more human. The visions haunted him, particularly the vision of his own death. Imagine carrying this knowledge. Imagine knowing with increasing certainty that your life ends in violence. Most people would be consumed by fear, others by despair. Sanguinius responds differently, however. He accepts it, not passively or joyfully, but with dignity. There is something profoundly noble about it. The older I get, the more I appreciate this aspect of his character. Because courage is often misunderstood. People imagine courage meaning not being afraid. In reality, courage means being afraid and moving forward anyway. Sanguinius embodies this perfectly. Then we come to the Blood Angels themselves, and honestly, I don't think any legion reflects its Primarch more completely. At first glance, the Blood Angels appear almost perfect. They're noble, heroic, beautiful even. The ideal warriors of the Imperium. Yet beneath that image lurks something terrible. The red thirst, the darkness, violence, the hunger, the possibility of losing themselves completely. Sound familiar? It should, because it mirrors Sanguinius exactly. The Blood Angels are his children not simply genetically but spiritually. They carry the same struggle, the same fear, the same burden. And unlike their father, they spent their lives fighting against it. That's why they remain one of the most beloved chapters in the setting. Not because they're flawless, because they're not. Because they fight their flaws every day, every battle, every moment. That struggle gives them depth, it gives them humanity, and it originates entirely from Sanguinius. One of the things that makes Sanguinius so compelling is that he understands darkness intimately. People often portray him as a shining hero, a radiant figure soaring above the battlefield, and that is certainly part of the picture. But what makes him so interesting is that he knows exactly how close he stands to the abyss. He understands rage, violence, temptation, even despair. He simply refuses to surrender to them. There is an enormous difference between innocence and virtue. Innocence means never facing darkness. Virtue means facing darkness and rejecting it. Sanguinius possesses virtue, perhaps more than any other Primarch. And then comes the Horus Heresy. And this is where his legend becomes immortal, forever. Because while many Primarchs contribute to the defense of Terra, Sanguinius becomes its symbol, its heart and soul really. At a time where everything appears lost, people look to the Angel, not merely because of his strength, because of what he represents. Hope, the possibility that goodness still matters, the possibility that sacrifice still matters, the possibility that humanity is worth saving. That symbolic role becomes increasingly important at the siege. That symbolic role becomes increasingly important as the siege progresses. Again and again, Sanguinius performs extraordinary feats, yet the most important thing he does may simply be inspiring others to continue onward. I've always found this so fascinating, really. In a setting obsessed with power, Sanguinius demonstrates the power of belief. And then we arrive at perhaps the most famous moment in all of Warhammer, really. The confrontation aboard the Vengeful Spirit. Now everyone knows the broad outline, the Emperor Horus Sanguinius, the final battle, the death of the Angel. It's mythology at this point. Yet what continues to resonate is not the outcome, it is the choice for me. Sanguinius knows what awaits him. He knows he walks towards his own death. The visions have shown him repeatedly, and still he goes. This is the essence of his character, not victory, but choice. The conscious decision to stand before Horus despite understanding the cost. Whether he believed he could win is almost irrelevant, really. He believed it was necessary, and so he acted. There is a quote that is often associated with Sanguinius that captures his philosophy beautifully. Only angels may fly. On the surface, it's a simple statement, yet beneath it lies something much deeper. The idea that some ideals are worth striving toward even if perfection remains impossible. That humanity becomes better through aspiration, through effort, through sacrifice. That was Sanguinius' entire life. And then he dies. The angel falls, the hero is gone, the dream ends. Except it doesn't. Because this is where Sanguinius becomes more than a Primarch, more than a hero, more than a character. He becomes a myth. 10,000 years later, his influence remains everywhere. The Blood Angels still fight in his name. The Black Rage itself echoes his final moments. Entire generations continue drawing strength from his example. It is extraordinary, really. Most Primarchs shaped history through their actions, but Sanguinius continues shaping history through his memory, his example. Which brings us to the fundamental question. Who was Sanguinius? Was he a warrior? Without question, few could rival him, if any. Was he a leader? Absolutely. The loyalty he inspired speaks for itself. Was he a hero? Perhaps more than anyone. Yet even those descriptions feel incomplete, really. Because at his core, Sanguinius represents something larger. Hope in the face of despair, courage in the face of fear, compassion in the face of cruelty, choice in the face of known destiny. Those ideas define him far more than any battlefield victory ever could. The galaxy remembers the wings, the sword, golden armor, glorious imagery, the angelic being. What people sometimes forget is that beneath all of that stood a man carrying an immense burden. A man haunted by visions, a man terrified of the darkness within himself, a man who knew exactly how his story would end, and who walked towards that ending anyway. Perhaps that is why Sanguinius remains so beloved. I know that he's my favourite Primarch for this reason. Not because he was perfect, because he wasn't. Not because he was powerful, because many Primarchs were. But because among all the Emperor's sons, Sanguinius may have been the one who most fully understood what it meant to be human. The fear, suffering, uncertainty, but still hanging on to hope regardless. And despite all of it, he chose to believe humanity was worth saving. In a universe defined by endless war, that might be one of the most extraordinary acts of faith of all. And perhaps that is why 10,000 years after his death, the angel still flies. Of all the Primarchs, Ferrus Manus may be the one most defined by an absence, which is a strange thing to say about a giant demigod with metal hands who spent much of his life smashing tanks apart and intimidating absolutely everyone within a 5-mile radius. Yet it is true. Because when people talk about Ferrus Manus, they rarely begin with Ferrus himself. They begin with Fulgrim, Istvan, they begin with the beheading, they begin with the tragedy of it. And while all of those things are undeniably important, they have also created an unfortunate side effect. Ferrus Manus is often remembered more for how he died rather than how he lived. And I think this is a shame really, because beneath that tragedy lies one of the most fascinating Primarchs in the entire setting really. A man whose entire philosophy revolves around strength. Not power, but strength itself. And contrary to what many people assume, those are not the same thing. In fact, I would argue that understanding the difference between them is the key to understanding Ferrus Manus. Because while many of his brothers spent their lives pursuing greatness, Ferrus spent much of his life pursuing mastery, not over others but over himself. And that distinction makes him far more interesting than he is often given credit for. To understand Ferrus, of course, you have to begin on Medusa. And Medusa is one of those worlds that feels almost designed specifically to produce somebody like Ferrus Manus, a harsh and brutal place. A world where survival is earned rather than granted, where weakness carries consequence, where comfort is largely theoretical really. Like many Primarch homeworlds, Medusa was unforgiving, and unlike worlds such as Fenris or Nostromo, Medusa lacked any real illusion about what it was really. It was hard, and everyone knew it was, and everybody lived accepting this reality. There is something very Ferrus Manus about it. No pretense, excuses, no self-pity, just the cold hard reality of it. And reality did not care how anybody felt about it either. From an early age, Ferrus distinguished himself through determination. Not diplomacy or charisma, not charm, but just his relentless determination. The sort of person who sees a mountain and immediately begins calculating how to climb it, rather than wondering whether he should climb it in the first place. This trait would define him throughout his life really. The famous story of the Silver Hands illustrates this perfectly, of course. According to the legend, Ferrus fought the great worm Aseroth and ultimately slew the creature, plunging his arms into its living metallic flesh and emerging with hands sheathed in living metal. Now, like many Primarch myths, the exact details are open to interpretation, but the symbolism here is fascinating, because people often focus on the hands themselves. The power, the metal, the strength of them. What interests me is the struggle of it. Ferrus sees something impossible and overcomes it, not because he's destined to, because he refuses to quit. That attitude becomes central to everything that he is really. The irony, of course, is that those metal hands eventually become associated with a philosophy Ferrus himself may not have entirely agreed with, but we'll come back to that later. It does matter enormously though. When the Emperor arrives, Ferrus joins the Great Crusade and quickly establishes himself as one of the most formidable commanders in the Imperium. And I mean formidable in the truest sense of the word. Ferrus Manus is not a Primarch people casually challenge. Even among his brothers, he commands immense respect. One thing I've always found interesting is how often other Primarchs speak highly of him, in a similar way to Sanguinius in many ways. Not affectionately, necessarily. Ferrus was not exactly hosting family barbecues every weekend, let's say, but they were respectful. They trusted his judgment, they respected his competence. They recognized his integrity. And this says a great deal, because Primarchs were not particularly generous when evaluating one another, let's be fair. Yet Ferrus consistently earned their admiration. Part of that comes from his honesty, I feel. Ferrus is perhaps one of the least deceptive Primarchs in general. What you see is very largely what you get. If he agrees with you, you'll know. If he disagrees, you'll definitely know. There is something refreshingly straightforward about him, really. In another setting, that might even be considered healthy. Unfortunately, as we know, this is Warhammer. Healthy behaviour tends to have a fairly limited lifespan. And then we come to the Iron Hands themselves. And here we encounter one of the most fascinating contradictions in the setting, really. Because modern Iron Hands are famous for their phrase, "The flesh is weak." Everyone knows this. It's one of the defining statements of the chapter, really. The rejection of weakness, the replacement of flesh with machinery, the pursuit of cold, hard efficiency, the abandonment of human frailty. Yet when you actually examine Ferrus Manus himself, the picture becomes more complicated. Ferrus did not hate humanity, he did not despise emotion, and he did not believe flesh inherently worthless either. In fact, there are moments where he explicitly warns against becoming dependent upon augmentation. He sees strength as something that must come from within, not something bolted onto your body afterwards. This distinction is, of course, crucial. The tragedy of the Iron Hands is that after Ferrus dies, they misunderstand him. Not completely, but significantly enough. They take fragments of his philosophy and exaggerate them until they become something entirely different. It's one of the saddest legacies any Primarch leaves behind, really. The sons who worship strength become increasingly disconnected from the very humanity their fathers sought to strengthen. I've always found this quite a fascinating dichotomy, because Ferrus is often remembered as cold, yet his chapter arguably becomes colder after he is gone. And then we come to Fulgrim, of course, and honestly no discussion of Ferrus can avoid Fulgrim. Their friendship is simply too important. Perhaps the most important friendship between any two Primarchs, really, which is ironic given how things end. The relationship works because the two men admire qualities within each other. Ferrus sees Fulgrim's creativity, his ambition, his artistry. Fulgrim sees Ferrus's discipline, his craftsmanship and his resilience. Each recognizes something valuable in the other. And for a time it genuinely works. They do become very close, perhaps closer than many Primarchs ever allow themselves to be. That's why the eventual betrayal hurts so much, really. Not because enemies become enemies, but because friends do. There is a profound difference here, obviously. One of the things that makes Ferrus compelling is his refusal to compromise his principles. When Fulgrim offers him a chance to join Horus, Ferrus doesn't hesitate. He doesn't waver, he doesn't rationalize, he just rejects the offer immediately. Now, some people interpret this as a stubbornness, and perhaps there is some truth in that. But I think it's something deeper. Ferrus knows who he is. He knows what he believes. There is a tremendous strength in his certainty of his character. The problem is that certainty can also become a rigidity. And nowhere is that more apparent than on Isstvan 5. The drop site massacre is one of the defining catastrophes of the heresy, and at its centre stands Ferrus Manus, angry and determined, refusing to back down. Part of him wants justice, part of him wants vengeance, part of him wants answers. Most of all, I think he wants his brother back, the old Fulgrim, the friend he once knew. The tragedy is that friend was already gone. And what follows is one of the most famous moments in Warhammer history. Fulgrim kills Ferrus Manus, the Gorgon falls, the Iron Hands are shattered, the heresy then escalates. And just like that, one of the Imperium's greatest champions is gone. I've often wondered how different the heresy might have been had Ferrus survived, because unlike many Primarchs, Ferrus possessed a remarkable ability to cut through the nonsense really. No mysticism, grand speeches, no elaborate philosophical detour. He was just action. All action, clarity, purpose. The Loyalists lose more than a warrior on Isstvan. They lose a stabilizing force really. A voice that might have mattered enormously in the years that followed. And perhaps that's why his death feels so significant to me. Not simply because he dies, but because the galaxy loses what he is. Which brings us to the fundamental question. Who was Ferrus Manus? Was he a warrior? Undoubtedly. One of the finest in the Imperium. Was he a craftsman? Absolutely. His creations were legendary. Was he strong? Perhaps stronger than most, yet none of those descriptions as usual capture him fully really. At his core, Ferrus Manus is a character obsessed with self-mastery. Not domination or glory, but mastery of the self. The belief that true strength comes from discipline, from perseverance, from confronting weakness, rather than pretending it doesn't exist. That philosophy defines everything. The galaxy remembers the metal hands, the hammer, the battlefield victories, the violent ending. What people sometimes overlook is the man beneath, the man before all the tragedy, the Primarch who valued honesty, the friend who believed Fulgrim could be saved, the leader who demanded excellence because he believed excellence truly mattered, the son who spent his life trying to become stronger without losing himself in the process. And perhaps that's why Ferrus remains such a fascinating figure, despite his relatively short role within the wider narrative. Because unlike many Primarchs, his tragedy is not what he became, it's what he never got the chance to become really. The heresy steals that future from him. The Imperium loses one of its greatest defenders. The Iron Hands lose their father. Fulgrim loses his closest friend, the only chance of redemption for Fulgrim really. And the galaxy loses a man who may have understood something many of his brothers never truly grasped. That strength is not measured by what you can destroy. It's measured really by what you can endure. And in a setting obsessed with power, it may be one of the most important lessons of all. Which makes it strangely fitting that Ferrus Manus continues to cast such a long shadow. Not because of the metal hand, not because of the legends, but because 10,000 years later people are still trying to live up to the standards that he set really, even if they don't always understand them. Of all the Primarchs, Roboute Guilliman may have undergone the most dramatic transformation in the eyes of the fanbase. Not because Games Workshop changed him, because people finally started paying attention to him. For years, Guilliman occupied a rather unusual place within Warhammer lore really. He was respected, important, influential, but somehow overlooked in many ways, or perhaps misunderstood might be a better word. To many people, Guilliman was simply the administrator, the bureaucrat, the man with the spreadsheets if you will. The Primarch who looked at the galaxy engulfed in endless war and thought, yes, but how do we organise the supply chain correctly? There were jokes, lots of them. Some of them admittedly are pretty funny. And for a long time, that perception of Guilliman really stuck. But then he has come back, and suddenly people realise something about him. The administrator was actually one of the most interesting characters in the setting really. Because beneath the image of the Empire Builder lies a profoundly human tragedy in him. A son trying to save an empire that no longer resembles the one that he helped to create. A statesman trapped in a nightmare. A rational man forced to navigate a galaxy that has become increasingly irrational. And perhaps most importantly, a Primarch who spends most of his life carrying responsibilities nobody else wants. Which when you think about it is an oddly reoccurring theme among the Emperor's sons. As with everyone, to understand Guilliman, you have to begin with his homeworld of Macragge. And unlike many Primarch homeworlds, Macragge was not a wasteland or a death world, not a nightmare realm of monsters and misery. It was actually functional, remarkably functional in fact. Now that may not sound particularly exciting by Primarch standards, Nobody writes epic songs about an efficient tax collection scheme. At least I hope they don't. But it matters enormously for his character, of course, because Macragge gave Guilliman something many of his brothers never received: stability in his childhood, structure and guidance, and actually, a family. The influence of Connor Guilliman, his adoptive father, cannot really be overstated. While many Primarchs grew up isolated or traumatized, Guilliman grew up learning how to govern, how to build, how to lead, how to think beyond the battlefield. And it shaped everything about him, really. I've always found it fascinating that Guilliman's greatest strength is not military genius. Now, before Ultramarine fans begin sharpening their chainswords, you have to hear me out. He is absolutely a military genius, one of the finest commanders in Imperial history, of course. But that isn't what makes him unique as such. Many Primarchs were brilliant generals, as we know: the Lion, Horus, Dawn, Perturabo. Several could claim the title. What makes Guilliman different is that he understands what comes after victory. Most conquerors focus on winning the war. Guilliman focuses on building the peace. And it's much harder, frankly much rarer as well. The Great Crusade was full of warriors. It was desperately short on nation builders. Guilliman excelled because he understood that conquering a world was only the beginning of the story. Somebody still had to govern it afterwards. Somebody still had to feed people, maintain infrastructure, create institutions, stability, the empire itself, prevent society from collapsing the moment the fleet departed. Those concerns may not sound glamorous, but empires are built upon them, and Guilliman understood this better than perhaps anyone, perhaps even the Emperor himself. As we know, the greatest example of this is Ultramar itself, because Ultramar is not merely a collection of worlds, it is a statement of Guilliman's ability, proof that humanity can be something more than just survival. While much of the Imperium stumbled from crisis to crisis, Ultramar remained prosperous. Cities flourished, trade expanded, culture developed. People actually lived rather than merely survived in a hive city somewhere. This distinction is obviously very important for Guilliman's character. Guilliman genuinely believed humanity deserved a future worth living in, not merely a future worth dying for. It may sound obvious, yet within Warhammer it is a radical concept, let me tell you. And then there is the relationship with his brothers. Honestly, this is where Guilliman becomes quite interesting for me. He occupies an interesting position among the Primarchs. He is widely respected, but he's rarely idolized. Many of his brothers recognize his competence, his intelligence, his ability, his reliability even. But some also find him frustrating, perhaps because he reminds them of responsibilities they'd rather ignore perhaps. And anyone who has ever been the responsible person in a group knows exactly how exhausting this can become. There is often a quote attributed to Guilliman during the heresy, which is, "We march for Macragge." Simple and direct, almost understated, which feels very Guilliman. Unlike many Primarchs, he rarely needs dramatic speeches. His strength lies in conviction rather than in theatre. He isn't flashy, but he is effective. And then comes the Horus Heresy. And like so many Primarchs, Guilliman loses almost everything. I've always thought people underestimate just how devastating the heresy was for him personally. Not simply because of the destruction, because of the betrayal. Guilliman genuinely believed in the Imperium, perhaps more than most. He believed the Great Crusade could create something that lasted, something meaningful, and then he watched that dream tear itself apart. Brother turned against brother, world turned against world. Everything he helped to build suddenly felt fragile, temporary, vulnerable. The creation of Imperium Secundus is perhaps one of the most revealing moments in the entire story. Often misunderstood, often criticized, but it is deeply revealing. Because Guilliman's instinct when faced with catastrophe is not despair, it's action. The galaxy appears to be collapsing, communication is broken down, terror may have already fallen, so Guilliman attempts to preserve civilization, not for himself but for humanity. Even when histories judge him harshly. Even when history judges him harshly, his motivations remain fundamentally noble. That's an important aspect of his character. Guilliman does make mistakes, and plenty of them, but they usually come from trying to save something rather than trying to gain something. After the heresy comes another defining contribution from him, the Codex Astartes. Now, depending on which Space Marine chapter you're speaking to, this is either one of the greatest documents ever written or a mild act of treason. There is rarely much middle ground on this one, but regardless of opinion, its importance cannot be overstated. The Codex fundamentally reshaped the Imperium into what it is today, really, and once again, it reveals something about Guilliman. He understands systems, how things really work. Not individuals or heroes, but systems. Heroes die, but ultimately, the system endures. The Codex is his attempt to create stability in a very unstable galaxy, to ensure humanity never again places so much power in the hands of a single commander. It's not perfect because nothing is, yet the reason behind it is difficult to dismiss. And then comes his wounding at the hands of Fulgrim, another defining moment for his character. For 10,000 years, Guilliman effectively vanished from history, preserved and frozen in stasis, suspended between life and death. The galaxy changes without him. The Imperium evolves without him. The dream decays without him. And when he finally awakens, he encounters something extraordinary. Not victory or success, but failure. Or at least what appears to be failure. Imagine helping build a civilization. Imagine sacrificing everything for it. And then imagine waking up 10,000 years later to discover it has become almost unrecognizable. That is Guilliman's reality. The rational empire builder returns to find a civilization ruled by superstition. The secular reformer returns to find a religious empire. The son returns to discover his father is worshipped like a god. And perhaps most ironic of all, he discovers that Lorgar's vision has won. I've always thought that this is one of the greatest pieces of irony in this setting, really. Guilliman spends much of his life opposing exactly this outcome, yet here he stands. The ecclesiarchy, the imperial cult, the worship of the god emperor. Everywhere he looks, he sees evidence that history took a path he never wanted. And still he keeps going. That more than anything else is why modern Guilliman, I think, has become such a compelling character. Because he is exhausted. Not physically, but existentially, spiritually, emotionally. He carries the burden of an empire that cannot function without him, and he knows it. There are moments in recent lore where Guilliman's frustration becomes almost palpable. His disappointment, loneliness, grief really. Many brothers dead, others missing, some monsters, and yet still he continues onward because ultimately somebody has to. Guilliman has become the man attempting to hold together a civilization that should arguably have collapsed centuries ago. Which brings us to the fundamental question. Who is Roboute Guilliman? Warrior, certainly. His achievements speak for themselves. Statesman, undoubtedly. Perhaps the greatest the Imperium has ever produced. Is he a leader? Without question. Entire sectors continue functioning because of his efforts. But as usual, these descriptions fail to fully capture him. At his core, Guilliman represents responsibility. The burden of responsibility. The loneliness, the relentless weight of responsibility. He is the Primarch who understands that victory means nothing if nobody survives to actually appreciate it. The galaxy remembers the blue armor, the Codex, the triumphs, and of course his return. What people sometimes overlook is the man beneath them, the son who genuinely believed humanity could build something better, the ruler who cared about ordinary lives, the brother who watched his family destroy itself, the Primarch who woke up in a future he barely recognized and decided to try and save it anyway. And perhaps that is why Guilliman has become so beloved in recent years. Not because he is flawless, because he isn't. Not because he's the strongest, because he probably isn't either, but because among all the Primarchs he may be the one facing the most impossible challenge. Everyone else fought to build it. Everyone else fought to build the Imperium. Guilliman has to live with what it became. And despite everything he's seen, all the disappointment, the grief, the frustration, he still believes humanity deserves a future. That stubborn optimism feels almost rebellious in modern Warhammer really, which is perhaps why it matters so much. Because in a galaxy consumed by darkness, Rabuse Guilliman remains one of the very few people still trying to keep the lights on. And some days, that may be the bravest thing any Primarch has ever done. Of all the Primarchs, Vulcan may be the one most difficult to talk about objectively, not because his lore is confusing, not because his character lacks depth, and certainly not because he isn't important. The difficulty comes from something much simpler. People liked Vulcan, genuinely liked him. Not merely respected, but they actually liked him. And when you're discussing the Primarchs, this is actually quite unusual, because the Primarchs are complicated people. Magnificent certainly, but complicated. Many are brilliant and deeply flawed. Many are heroic and terrifying in equal measure. Many possess qualities that inspire admiration while simultaneously making them difficult to live with for more than 5 minutes. But Vulcan was different. Not perfect, far from it, but he was a different character. If Guilliman was the statesman, the lion, the knight, Russ, the executioner, and Magnus the scholar, then Vulcan is perhaps the closest thing the Imperium ever had to a genuinely good man. Now, before the comment section erupts into civil war involving 17 separate Primarch fanbases, let me clarify. Good by Warhammer standards, which admittedly is a bit like being declared the healthiest person in a plague ward. The competition isn't exactly fierce, but still the point does remain. Because when you strip away the armor, the legends and the mythology, Vulcan possesses something many of his brothers struggle with, a genuine human empathy. And that single trait ends up defining almost everything about him. To understand Vulcan, like all the Primarchs, you must go to his homeworld of Nocturne. And Nocturne is one of those worlds that somehow manages to be both beautiful and absolutely horrific at the same time. Volcanic landscape, ash-covered plains, massive tectonic upheaval, predatory creatures the size of buildings, regular natural disasters that would probably qualify as apocalyptic events on most planets. In other words, a fairly standard Primarch upbringing for most of them. Yet despite its dangers, Nocturne produced a culture unlike almost any other homeworld. Community, family, it all mattered. People survived because they helped one another survive. Strength existed to protect, not to dominate. This distinction became central to Vulcan's worldview, because while many Primarchs learned leadership through conquest, Vulcan learned leadership through responsibility, the strong caring for the weak, the skilled helping the inexperienced, the fortunate protecting the vulnerable. Those values stayed with him throughout his life and really shaped his character. Honestly, they make him feel surprisingly human, really. One of the things I've always found fascinating about Vulcan is that he never seems particularly interested in proving himself. Many Primarchs carry enormous insecurity. Perturabo desperately wants his recognition. Fulgrim seeks his perfection. Mortarion wants validation, and Angron always wanted freedom. Even Horus spent much of his life worrying about his place in the Emperor's affections. Vulcan largely avoids these traps, not because he lacks ambition, because he understands who he is. There is a quiet confidence about him, the sort of confidence that doesn't require constant reassurances. And this is rare among demigods. The discovery of Vulcan by the Emperor follows a pattern familiar to many Primarch stories. The lost son found, the reunion, the beginning of a new chapter. Yet even here, Vulcan feels slightly different, because unlike some of his brothers, he never seems particularly consumed by the questions of destiny. What matters to Vulcan is not what he is, it's what he does. And again throughout his story, actions matter more than titles. Character, matters more than status, and responsibility matters more than glory. I've always thought that if Vulcan had been born an ordinary human, he probably would have ended up behaving much the same way. Admittedly, with fewer giant hammers and significantly less lava, but fundamentally the same person. And then we come to the Salamanders, and honestly few legions reflect their Primarch more completely. The Salamanders are unusual among the Adeptus Astartes, not because they're weak, quite the opposite. Not because they're less capable, again, quite the opposite. They're unusual because they actively value human lives. It sounds absolutely obvious. It shouldn't be unusual, yet in the grim darkness of the far future it certainly is. Many Space Marine chapters protect humanity in an abstract sense. Humanity is a civilization, an idea, a strategic objective. But the Salamanders often protect actual, specific humans, named humans, people, and this distinction is enormously important for their worldview. There are countless stories throughout Imperial history of Salamanders risking themselves to save civilians, holding evacuation corridors, defending refugees, refusing to abandon ordinary people when doing so would be tactically convenient. Those actions come directly from Vulcan's example. His sons inherited his properties, and perhaps more importantly his perspective on the world. Because Vulcan never forgets who the Imperium is supposed to be serving. Not itself, but humanity, the people. That may sound simple, but it really isn't. And then there is Vulcan the Craftsman, another interesting element to his character. Honestly, I don't think this aspect of his character gets enough attention really. Among the Primarchs, Vulcan may actually be one of the greatest creators, alongside Ferrus perhaps. The artifacts associated with him are legendary, weapons and armor, war machines, masterpieces of engineering and artistry. Yet what fascinates me is not the quality of his creations, it's why he creates them. Ferrus Manus crafts because he values mastery. Fulgrim crafts because he pursues perfection. Vulcan crafts because he wants things to endure, because he wants to help protect people, because creation itself has value. There is something deeply hopeful about his philosophy in this regard, particularly in the Warhammer setting. Most characters spend their lives destroying other things, but Vulcan spends a surprising amount of his life building things, which perhaps explains why so many people gravitate towards him. He feels different. And then comes the heresy, and here we encounter one of the darkest chapters of his story. Because if there's one Primarch who suffers during the heresy in a way that feels almost excessive, it's Vulcan. Captured by Comrade Kurz, killed, resurrected again. As we know, Vulcan is a perpetual. He was tormented physically and psychologically again and again and again. The fact that Vulcan is a perpetual changes the nature of suffering itself for him. Death ceases to be an escape. Every defeat becomes temporary. Every pain returns. I've often thought that Kurz chose Vulcan for that reason, because Kurz wanted to prove a point. He wanted to break hope itself, and Vulcan embodies hope more than perhaps any other Primarch. What follows is some of the most disturbing material in the entire heresy. Not because of the violence, Warhammer is hardly short of it, because of the persistence, the sheer determination required to continue, to endure. Most people would break, many Primarchs maybe would. Vulcan somehow keeps going. Which brings us to another important aspect of his character. People often mistake his kindness for a kind of weakness. Warhammer certainly does. Many characters within the setting do. Even some readers do occasionally. Vulcan demonstrates why this assumption is wrong. Because kindness and strength are not opposites. In many ways they reinforce one another. The capacity to remain compassionate in a cruel universe requires extraordinary resilience. It's easy to become cynical, to become indifferent, easy to stop caring. Vulcan never really does, and that's remarkable. We arrive then at one of the most interesting questions surrounding his story, the disappearance of him. Because unlike Ferrus Manus or Sanguinius, Vulcan's fate remains unresolved. the artifacts, prophecies, and rumours, the possibility of his return. It's one of the great enduring mysteries in the setting. And honestly, if there's one loyalist Primarch whose return feels increasingly plausible, it is Vulcan. Not simply because he is alive, because the Imperium desperately needs somebody like him. Think about the current state of the galaxy. Endless war, religious extremism, political dysfunction. Civilizations held together with prayer and duct tape. A fairly normal Tuesday in the 42nd millennium now. Then imagine Vulcan walking back into this reality. The Primarch who actually likes ordinary humans. The Primarch who understands sacrifice. The Primarch who remembers why the Imperium exists in the first place. It's a fascinating possibility, particularly when placed alongside figures like Guilliman and the Lion. Because Vulcan brings something neither of them fully possesses. Genuine warmth. Not military, strategic, human warmth. The Imperium is desperately short of this, I feel. Which brings us to the question. Who is Vulcan? Was he a warrior? Undoubtedly one of the greatest. Was he a craftsman? Without question. Probably the best one, if any. Was he a hero? Perhaps more than most. Yet none of those descriptions fully explain him either. At his core, Vulcan is a protector, the ultimate protector. A man who believed strength existed for a purpose. A man who understood that power without compassion quickly becomes a tyranny. A man who never forgot the people standing behind the walls he defended. The galaxy remembers the hammer, the forge, his giant stature, his perpetual nature. What people sometimes overlook is his heart. The simple humanity beneath everything else. The son who cared, the brother who endured, the father who taught his legion that civilians really matter. The Primarch who looked at a brutal galaxy and refused to become as cruel as it was. And perhaps that's why Vulcan remains so beloved. Not because he's perfect, because he isn't. Not because he's the strongest, because he probably isn't either. But because among all the Emperor's sons, Vulcan may be the clearest example of what they were supposed to be. Not weapons or conquerors or gods, but guardians. The tragedy of the Imperium is that it often forgets this distinction, but Vulcan never did. And perhaps that's why 10,000 years after his disappearance, people still await for his return. Because in a setting filled with warriors, prophets, kings, and monsters, there remains something uniquely powerful about a man whose greatest strength was simply caring about the people he was fighting for. Sometimes that is harder than winning a war, and Vulcan understood that better than most. Of all the Primarchs, Corvus Corax may be the one who understands freedom best. Not power or duty, but freedom itself. This distinction matters more than you might think for his character. Because when most people talk about Corax, they picture the obvious things, of course. Black armor, ravens, the stealth mechanics. The shadowy assassin slipping through impossible defenses while everyone else is still arguing over the battle plan. And to be fair, all of those things are important for Corax. He is one of the finest practitioners of stealth warfare in the Imperium and has ever produced, perhaps the finest. Yet if you reduce him merely to a master of infiltration, you miss the most important things about him. Because underneath all the mythology, Corax is fundamentally a revolutionary. A liberator, a man whose entire worldview was shaped by the belief that nobody should live in chains. This idea sits at the center of everything to do with his character, his victories, failures, his relationships, and ultimately, his guilt. Even his eventual disappearance. If there is a single thread running through the life of Corvus Corax, it is the struggle between freedom and responsibility. And like so many Primarch stories, that struggle becomes tragic. To understand Corax, you have to begin on Lycaeus, his home world, or as it would later become known, Deliverance. And honestly, if there is a more fitting origin for Corax, in the entire setting I struggle to think of one really, because Lycaeus was a prison moon. Not metaphorically, but literally a giant prison orbiting the industrial world of Kiavir alone. a place where generations lived and died under oppression, a place where human lives were treated as simply a resource, a place where freedom barely existed as a concept. Into this world came Corvus Corax, and unlike many Primarchs, he did not rise through conquest, he rose through a rebellion. This difference matters enormously for his character. The Lion became the knight, Russ became a king, Guilliman a ruler of an entire empire. Corax was a revolutionary. From the very beginning, he stood with the oppressed rather than above them. I've always found this interesting about his character, because despite being a Primarch, Corax consistently identifies with ordinary people, much in the same way as Vulcan for many reasons. Not in the abstract way politicians try to do, but genuinely and personally. He remembers what oppression feels like. He remembers powerlessness and injustice. Those memories never really leave him. He does have an interesting parallel with Konrad Curze, but obviously they take very different approaches to justice. Eventually, Corax leads his rebellion and frees Lycaeus from its masters, and right away we begin to see what makes him unique. Because Corax is not interested in replacing one tyrant with another. This happens surprisingly often through history. One revolution succeeds and immediately creates a new dictatorship. The Hunger Games immediately springs to mind when I think of this. Corax actively rejects this path. He fights because he believes people deserve freedom, not because he wants to rule them himself. There is a humility to that which often gets overlooked in his character, particularly among the Primarchs. Most Primarchs assume leadership is their natural role. Corax often treats leadership as a responsibility rather than just a reward for his nature. This distinction follows him through his life really. And then comes the Emperor, and unlike some of his brothers, Corax's reaction is actually surprisingly interesting and complex. He joins the Great Crusade and he does serve. Loyally. He accepts his place within the Imperium, but there is always a slight tension with him, a discomfort if you will, because Corax understands authority. He understands why strong institutions are necessary, but he also understands how easily power can become abuse. The awareness never disappears for him. I've often thought Corax possesses one of the most balanced perspectives among the Primarchs. He smacks me of a Jagadai Khan, someone who is loyal, but he is also removed and practical at the same time. He's neither naive enough to reject authority entirely, but he's not trusting enough to embrace it blindly. He walks somewhere between those two extremes. It's a difficult path to maintain, but like Jagadai, it proves to be fairly valuable for him through the course of his life. And then comes the Raven Guard, of course. Few legions reflect their Primarch so completely as the Raven Guard, because the Raven Guard are not interested in glorious last stands, overwhelming force, battlefield theatrics if you will. They actually fight intelligently, efficiently and precisely. The goal is not to look impressive, the goal is to win. I've always appreciated this honest, candid style of warfare from Corax really. He's a practical man, and it feels refreshingly grounded in a world where there is so much pomp and ceremony around the Space Marines, especially during the Legion period in the Horus Heresy. Many of the Primarch possess enormous egos, frankly, but Corax possesses enormous expectations, usually of himself. If there is a difficult path and an easy path, Corax often chooses the difficult one if he believes it will save lives. Not because he enjoys suffering, because he values outcomes over the appearance of looking good. The Raven Guard become masters of infiltration, sabotage and precision warfare because those methods align with Corax's philosophy. Victory should cost as little as possible, particularly in human lives. Again, this sounds obvious, but within the context of the Great Crusade it is surprisingly unusual. And remember, his whole philosophy is he was brought up alongside other people, cared for them genuinely, rebelled against the slave owners of them, and liberated these ordinary people. He values human lives, which is very important, similar to Vulcan in terms of his entire view on the Imperium later on. And then comes the Horus Heresy, of course, and honestly, this is where things get very tragic for Corax very quickly. Not because he falls, he doesn't. He doesn't betray anyone, he remains loyal. His tragedy is something much more painful. His failure, or rather the feeling of failure. The drop site massacre on Istvan V devastates the Raven Guard. Entire generations wiped out, the Legion shattered. Brothers die by the thousands. Dreams die with them, and Corax survives. Sometimes survival is the hardest outcome, because survivors have to live with the memory. I've always found Corax's response to Istvan incredibly compelling, really. Many Primarchs react to disaster with anger, some react with denial, vengeance, but Corax just reacts with guilt. Overwhelming guilt, the sort of guilt that settles into a person's bones and never quite leaves. Because whilst others see a betrayal, Corax sees his own failure to prevent it. Whether that's fair or not is almost irrelevant. It's what he believes. And belief in Warhammer, as we know, shapes reality. And then comes one of the darkest chapters of his life, the attempt to rebuild the Raven Guard. Now on paper it sounds hopeful. The Emperor does provide genetic material. The Legion could recover. The future remains possible. Except, of course, we know this is Warhammer. Hope rarely arrives without a complication. The Alpha Legion sabotage the process. The new recruits become twisted, mutated, broken. And suddenly Corax finds himself facing a nightmare. The Liberator and the Protector, the man who values humanity, standing before creatures created through his own desperation. I've always thought this moment reveals more about Corax's personality than anything else for me, because he doesn't rationalize what happened. He doesn't hide from it. He doesn't pretend everything's fine. He recognizes the horror of what he's done immediately, and it destroys him ultimately. There is a sadness to Corax after the heresy that feels different from many of his brothers. Not the rage of Leman Russ or the bitterness of Mortarion, not the grief of Dawn per se, but a sadness, a quiet and persistent sadness. The sense of a man carrying burdens that nobody else can see, really. And then he disappears. Honestly, few Primarch fates are as fascinating as Corax's for me right now, because he doesn't simply vanish, he actually changes. The stories surrounding him after the heresy become increasingly unusual, increasingly mythical, increasingly tied to the warp itself. Eventually we encounter perhaps the most intriguing version of Corax in all of Warhammer. The Shadow Hunter, the thing lurking in the warp, the creature pursuing Lorgar across eternity. Now, depending on your perspective, this is either incredibly cool or quite unsettling, possibly both. Personally, I lean towards both, because there is something wonderfully poetic about all of it. The man who dedicated his life to fighting tyrants becomes the eternal hunter of one of the greatest traitors in history. The Liberator becomes the shadow stalking in the darkness. It's very Corvus Corax, really. A little tragic, a little dramatic, and a little unsettling, exactly as he probably should be. The question everyone asks, when will he return? Honestly, I think there is a strong argument that he will. Like all of the Primarchs, really, it's more a question of when, not if at this point. More than that, I think he should, because modern Warhammer is increasingly becoming a story about the returning Primarchs. Guilliman, the Lion, others seem inevitable, and Corax occupies a particularly interesting position among all of them, really. Because unlike Guilliman, who represents order, or the Lion, who represents duty, I think Corax represents something like conscience. He asks the uncomfortable question. He challenges assumptions. He remembers why power exists in the first place, and he also takes responsibility for his actions. The modern Imperium could desperately use somebody like this. Whether it would listen is another matter entirely. Which brings us to the question, who is Corvus Corax? Warrior, undoubtedly one of the finest, revolutionary without question, his entire life has been spent proving it. Was he a hero? Arguably more than most, but as usual, these descriptions don't really fully capture his character. At his core, Corax is a man haunted by responsibility, a man who believes freedom is worth fighting for, a man who understands that power must always justify itself, a man who never stops questioning whether he could have done more. The galaxy remembers the Raven imagery, the stealth, assassinations, the shadowy behavior. What people sometimes overlook is the idealist, the liberator, the son who fought against slavery before he even met the Emperor, the Primarch who cared enough to feel guilty when things did go wrong. And perhaps that's why Corax remains such a compelling character for me. Because among all the Primarchs, he may be the one who feels the most aware of the costs of failure. Not in strategic or military terms, but in the human terms of lives lost, the opportunities wasted, the people left behind. These things really matter to him, perhaps more than they should. And that is both his greatest strength and his greatest weakness, really. 10,000 years after the heresy, somewhere in the darkness beyond mortal sight, the shadow of Corvus Corax still endures, still hunting and watching, still carrying the weight of choices made long ago. And if he ever returns to the Imperium, he may discover something rather uncomfortable. The chains he spent his entire life fighting have not disappeared. They've simply changed shape. And few Primarchs are less likely to ignore that than the Lord of the Raven Guard.